The sun hung low over Willow Creek, Tennessee, casting a golden haze across the sleepy town on a quiet Sunday morning in November 2025. The air carried a crisp bite just shy of frost, and the faint hum of a country ballad drifted from the open windows of pickup trucks parked along Main Street. At the heart of the town stood the Rusty Spoon Diner, its neon sign flickering faintly, promising hot coffee and warm biscuits to anyone who stepped inside. The place was a local institution, its checkered floors worn smooth by decades of boots and sneakers, its walls plastered with photos of high school football heroes and faded Support Our Troops posters. Veterans Day was 2 days away, and the diner was packed with families, farmers, and retirees, all drawn by the promise of a free pancake stack for anyone who'd served. Through the glass door limped Marcus Tate, a 78-year-old black man whose weathered frame told stories his lips rarely shared. His left leg, a prosthetic worn down by time, clicked softly against the tile as he leaned on a polished oak cane. In his right hand he balanced a tray of cold scrambled eggs, a slice of dry toast, and a styrofoam cup of lukewarm water. His brown corduroy jacket hung loose on his shoulders, a faded patch on the chest barely legible, U.S. Navy. On his left wrist, half hidden by the cuff, was a tattoo, a trident piercing a coiled rope, the mark of a seal from a time most in the diner had only read about in history books. Marcus's face was etched with deep lines, his gray hair cropped close, his eyes a pale hazel that held a quiet intensity. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the crowded room for an empty seat, though he knew from years of walking into places like this that finding one wouldn't be the real challenge. The diner buzzed with life, plates clattering, kids laughing, and the low murmur of gossip weaving through the air. At a large table in the center, 4 men in their late 40s sat sprawled over their breakfast platters, their voices loud enough to cut through the noise. They wore flannel shirts and trucker hats, one sporting a T-shirt that read "God, Guns, and Glory." The leader, a burly man named Dale Carver, leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips as he spotted Marcus. "Look at that," Dale said, nudging his buddy Ray. "Old guy's probably here for the free grub. Bet he's got some sob story ready to go." Ray chuckled, squinting at Marcus's slow steps. "That tattoo looks like he scratched it on with a ballpoint pen back in the 70s. No way he's seen action." Their laughter rippled across the table, drawing a few curious glances from nearby booths. Marcus heard every word. His right ear had gone fuzzy with age, but insults always found their mark. He didn't flinch, didn't turn. His jaw tightened just a fraction as he shuffled toward a small table by the wall tucked near the jukebox where the light was dim and the stairs were fewer. He lowered himself into the chair, his movements deliberate, the tray settling with a soft clink. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from the stubborn ache that came with carrying 78 years of life. He took a bite of the eggs, now rubbery and tasteless, and chewed slowly, his gaze fixed on the scratched tabletop. He was near for the food. He never was. Today was the anniversary, not of a battle or a medal, but of a promise made in the humid jungles of Vietnam, one he'd kept every year since. 49 years ago, Marcus and his best friend Caleb Monroe had sat under a tarp in the rain sharing a stale ration bar. Caleb, a wiry kid from Memphis with a laugh that could lighten even the darkest nights, had promised they'd celebrate when they got home. "First thing we do, Marcus," Caleb had said, his eyes bright despite the mud caked on his face. "We're hitting a diner. I'm buying you a cheeseburger, the greasiest one we can find." Marcus had laughed, clapping Caleb's shoulder, thinking they had all the time in the world. But Caleb never made it back. A landmine took him and Marcus's left leg 3 weeks later. The war took more than flesh. It took the part of Marcus that believed promises could outlast bullets. Yet every year, on this day, he found a diner, ordered a meal, and sat alone, not for the food, but for Caleb. A soft voice broke his thoughts. Sir?" A young waitress, maybe 19, stood beside his table, her blonde ponytail swinging nervously. Her name tag read Holly. She clutched a notepad, her eyes darting to the floor. "I'm real sorry, but some folks said you're making them uncomfortable. The manager asked if you could maybe move to the patio." Her voice cracked on the last word and she shifted her weight, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Marcus looked up, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not surprised, just tired. He'd seen this look before in bus stations, barber shops, and small-town stores. The kind of look that said he didn't belong not because of what he'd done, but because of what people assumed he was. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, and reached for his tray. The fork rattled against the plate as he stood, steadying himself with his cane. "All right," he said, his voice low like gravel underfoot. He didn't argue. He never did. Arguments didn't change hearts, and Marcus had learned long ago to save his strength for battles that mattered. As he passed the center table, Dale leaned back, his voice carrying over the chatter. "If that guy's a SEAL, I'm the damn Secretary of Defense." The table erupted in laughter, sharp and mean. Marcus kept moving, his steps uneven but steady. His lips stayed closed, but his chest tightened, a familiar ache that wasn't just age or grief. A little girl in a booth nearby, her pigtails bouncing, tugged at her dad's sleeve. "Why's that man walk funny, Daddy?" Her father, a man in a Vols cap, glanced over and muttered, "Just some old drifter, sweetie. Don't stare." The manager, a wiry man named Carl, stood behind the counter, his eyes fixed on a stack of receipts, pretending not to notice. Outside, the patio was empty save for a couple of stray leaves skittering across the concrete. The air was cool, the sun warm enough to take the edge off. Marcus eased into a metal chair at a small table by a row of azaleas, their blooms long gone. The chair scraped as he settled, his breath escaping in a long, slow sigh. He set the tray down, the eggs now pale and congealed, the toast soggy at the edges. Through the diner's window he could see the crowd inside, families sharing plates, couples laughing, Dale and his crew still grinning over their coffee. The glass wasn't just a barrier, it was a reminder of the invisible wall people built when they saw a limping old man in a worn jacket. Marcus was used to it, but used to it didn't mean immune. He poked at the toast, his fork moving mechanically. The sounds of the diner, clinking silverware, muffled laughter reached him faintly like echoes from a world he wasn't part of. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the chill in his knuckles, the dull throb in the socket where his prosthetic met what was left of his thigh. There was a time when he could swim 2 miles in open water, carry a wounded man through a firefight, navigate a jungle by starlight. That leg, the real one, was gone, buried in a rice paddy somewhere near the Mekong Delta, along with Caleb and too many others. The war had taken pieces of Marcus, but the world back home kept chipping away at what was left. He reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing a folded envelope tucked inside. The paper was thin, the edges frayed from years of handling. Inside was a letter, handwritten in fading ink from his old CO, Captain Ellis Reed. "Tate, you were the rock. Never asked for glory, but you carried us through hell and back. We owe you." Marcus hadn't kept it for pride. He kept it because it was proof. Proof that he'd been more than a shadow, that he'd done something worth remembering, even if the world forgot. He didn't pull it out now. He didn't need to. The words were burned into his memory, as clear as the laughter still spilling from Dale's table. The laughter grew louder, sharper, like a blade twisting in an old wound. Marcus's hands stilled, his fork hovering above the plate. He looked at the window, catching his reflection. Stooped shoulders, lined face, a man who'd outlived his own story. Inside, Dale pointed toward the patio, saying something that made Ray slap the table, their grins wide and careless. Marcus didn't look away. He didn't clench his fists or curse under his breath. He just sat there, holding the fork like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. He wouldn't go back inside. He wouldn't raise his voice. That wasn't who he was. But deep inside, something stirred. Not anger, not defiance, but a quiet resolve. They didn't need to know his name, but one day they'd feel the weight of what they'd done. The bell over the diner door jingled, faint but clear, as a new customer stepped inside. Marcus didn't notice. He took another bite of toast, chewing slowly, his eyes on the horizon, where the hills met the sky. The promise he'd made to Caleb was heavier than the tray, heavier than the years. And no matter how many doors closed or how many voices mocked, he'd keep carrying it, because some promises were worth more than pride. The Rusty Spoon Diner sat under the weight of its own noise, a symphony of clinking forks, muffled laughter, and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. Outside, Marcus Tate sat alone on the patio, his cold eggs untouched, his gaze lost in the hills beyond Willow Creek. The faint hum of the town carried on, oblivious to the man whose life had been carved by wars fought and promises kept. Inside, the four men at the center table, Dale Carver and his crew, continued their banter, their voices sharp with mockery, their laughter a blade that cut deeper than they could know. Marcus didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He'd felt that kind of dismissal before, in countless diners, gas stations, and quiet streets, where his limp and his silence made him invisible. But invisibility, he learned, was a heavy thing to carry. The bell above the diner door chimed, sharp and clear, cutting through the chatter like a warning shot. A young man stepped inside, his presence commanding even in its simplicity. Ethan Cole, 29, a Navy SEAL on leave, moved with the kind of coiled precision that marked someone who'd been trained to walk through hell and come out steady. His black boots hit the tile with purpose. His gray hoodie unzipped just enough to show a glimpse of a dog tag resting against his chest. His eyes, sharp and green, scanned the room, not out of habit but instinct. He was about to head for the counter when his gaze caught on the lone figure outside. Marcus, hunched slightly, his cane resting against a chair, his wrist bearing a faded tattoo, a trident piercing a coiled rope. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The diner's noise faded to a dull roar, like the world had been dunked underwater. He knew that mark, not from a book, not from a museum, but from a grainy slide projected during SEAL training, a relic of a team so vital yet so overlooked they called them the Shadows. And one name had been etched into every recruit's mind: M7 Tate. Ethan didn't hesitate. He turned, his boots squeaking faintly against the tile, and pushed through the patio door. The cool November air hit him as he stepped outside, his heart pounding louder than it had in any training drill. Marcus didn't look up at first, his fork still hovering over the plate, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. Ethan approached, his steps slow but deliberate. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but thick with reverence. "Were you with SEAL Team Delta M7 Tate?" Marcus's head lifted, his hazel eyes narrowing slightly, as if testing the weight of the question. He blinked once, the lines on his face deepening. "That was a lifetime ago," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the breeze. "But yeah, that was me." Ethan straightened, his shoulders squaring as if standing before a commanding officer. Without a word, he raised his right hand in a salute, sharp, unwavering, the kind that carried the weight of every oath he'd ever sworn. It wasn't just respect, it was recognition, a bridge across decades of sacrifice. "Sir," Ethan said, his voice louder now, carrying into the diner through the open door, "they still teach your extraction maps at Coronado. You saved 23 men in Operation Nightfall. Your routes got 'em home when the radios went dead. You're the reason I learned how to navigate under fire." Marcus stared, his lips parting slightly, his breath catching. The name M7 hadn't crossed his ears in over 40 years. His hand, still gripping the fork, trembled. Not from age, but from something deeper, something that had been buried under silence and time. Inside him, a crack formed in the wall he'd built to keep the world out, a wall forged from years of being unseen. Ethan turned, stepping back into the diner, his eyes blazing with a fire that silenced the room before he even spoke. "This man," he said, his voice cutting through the clatter like a gunshot, "has every right to sit wherever he damn well pleases. If anyone here feels uncomfortable around Marcus Tate, they're the ones who don't belong." The words landed like a grenade, stopping forks mid-bite, freezing laughter in throats. Dale Carver's smirk vanished, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. Ray's eyes dropped to the table, his fingers fidgeting with a napkin. The diner, once alive with noise, fell into a stillness so profound it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. From a booth near the back, an older woman in a quilted jacket stood, her hands trembling but resolute. She didn't speak, just clapped, slow, deliberate, each sound a declaration. A man in a flannel shirt, his beard streaked with gray, rose next, his chair scraping against the floor. Then a teenage boy, his hoodie emblazoned with the local high school logo, stood with his mother. One by one, the diner came to its feet, not in a rush, not with cheers, but with a quiet, unshakable reverence. Marcus, still outside, watched through the window, his eyes wide, his breath shallow. He hadn't asked for this. He'd never asked for anything. But the sight of strangers standing for him, not out of pity but out of respect, hit him like a wave he hadn't braced for. His hand tightened around his cane, and a single tear traced the lines of his face, falling unnoticed onto the cold concrete. The manager, Carl, stepped out from behind the counter, his face pale, his usual swagger gone. He pushed open the patio door, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Tate, I'm sorry. That was wrong what we did. Your meal's on us, and we'd be honored if you'd come back inside. Any table you want." Marcus looked at him, his eyes steady but soft, like he was seeing not just Carl, but every person who'd ever turned away. "No need," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I came for a promise, not the food." Carl swallowed, nodding, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Ethan stepped closer to Marcus's table, glancing at the tray of untouched eggs. "Mind if I sit, sir?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost like a son asking a father. Marcus hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Go ahead," he said. "Name was Caleb Monroe, my best friend. He swore we'd eat together when we got back, never got the chance." Ethan sat, his eyes locked on Marcus, not with pity but with a hunger to understand. "Tell me about him," he said simply, leaning forward. Before Marcus could answer, the patio door opened again. Holly, the young waitress, stepped out, her hands shaking as she held a fresh pot of coffee. Her eyes were red, her voice trembling. "Mr. Tate, I'm so sorry," she said, her words breaking. "I didn't know who you were. My grandpa served too. He never talked about it, but he had a tattoo like yours. His name was Caleb Monroe." The words hit Marcus like a bullet he hadn't seen coming. His fork slipped, clattering against the plate. His hand moved to his jacket, pulling out a creased black and white photo. Two young men in fatigues grinning in front of a helicopter, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. Marcus held it out, his fingers trembling. "This him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Holly stared at the photo, her breath hitching as tears spilled down her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak, her hand covering her mouth. "He talked about you," she said, her voice cracking. "Said you were the brother he'd never had. Said if he didn't make it, you'd keep his promise." Marcus's eyes glistened, the weight of 49 years crashing over him. The jungle, the rain, Caleb's laugh, the explosion that took everything. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but his hand reached out, resting on Holly's arm, a silent bridge between past and present. Ethan looked between them, his own eyes damp, his jaw tight. "He's still with us, sir," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Because of you. Because you kept going." Inside the diner, the silence held, heavy and alive. Dale and his crew sat frozen, their laughter long gone. One by one they stood, leaving cash on the table, their heads low as they slipped out the door, their half-eaten meals abandoned. The other diners watched Marcus, Holly, and Ethan through the window, not with curiosity, but with awe, as if witnessing something sacred. Marcus looked at the photo in his hand, at Caleb's frozen smile, and for the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his promise shift. Not lighter, but shared. Holly sat beside him, her tears falling freely now, and Ethan stayed, his presence a quiet vow to carry Marcus's story forward. The diner, the town, the world inside that moment. It all paused, holding its breath for a man who'd never asked to be seen, but could no longer be ignored. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, brimming with the kind of truth that could break a heart and mend it in the same breath. The Rusty Spoon Diner stood quiet under the fading Tennessee sun, its neon sign buzzing softly as dust settled over Willow Creek. The patio where Marcus Tate had sat just a week ago, his cold eggs untouched and his heart heavy with a promise kept, now felt like sacred ground. The town hadn't been the same since that Sunday morning when Ethan Cole's salute and Holly's tears had cracked open a truth long buried. The air carried a new weight, not of judgment, but of reverence, as if Willow Creek had collectively exhaled and found something worth holding on to. Marcus, though, hadn't returned to the diner. He was back at his small auto shop on the edge of town, his hands stained with grease, his cane propped against a workbench, his life resuming its quiet rhythm. But the world he'd tried to keep at arm's length was closing in, and it wasn't done with him yet. By Monday, whispers of what happened at the Rusty Spoon had spread like wildfire. A grainy cell phone photo, snapped through the diner's window, captured Ethan mid-salute, his face fierce with conviction, and Marcus, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and vulnerability. The image hit Willow Creek's community Facebook page first, shared by a teenage girl who'd been in the diner with her dad. "This is what respect looks like," she wrote. By Tuesday, it had jumped to veteran groups, then to regional pages, each share adding a layer of awe. "Who is this man?" people asked. "Why didn't we know?" Comments poured in, stories of fathers who'd served in silence, of grandmothers who'd carried war scars without a word. The photo wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror, forcing strangers to face the heroes they'd overlooked. Marcus didn't know. He didn't own a smartphone, didn't scroll social media. He still wrote checks for his bills and read the local paper on his porch with his old Shepherd Duke at his feet. But on Wednesday morning, he stepped outside to find a small bundle of envelopes tied with twine on his doorstep. No note, no sender, just a stack of letters, some in careful cursive, others in the wobbly scrawl of children. He carried them inside, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of something unfamiliar. Connection. Sitting at his kitchen table, the same one where he'd eaten alone for decades, he opened the first one. "Dear Mr. Tate," it began in a third grader's uneven print. "Thank you for being brave. My dad says you're a hero, but you don't act like it, and that's why you are one. What's it like to keep a promise for so long?" Marcus's breath caught. He opened another. "My grandpa was in Vietnam too," a high schooler wrote. "He never talked about it, but I wish I'd asked. Can you tell me what it means to serve?" Letter after letter they poured out. Questions, gratitude, stories of loss and pride. Marcus read them all, his eyes glistening, Duke's head resting on his knee. For the first time in years, the silence of his home didn't feel empty. By Friday, the town council called. They wanted Marcus to speak at a Veterans Day ceremony, a small event at the courthouse square, just a few folding chairs and a flag-draped podium. "Nothing fancy," the mayor's assistant said, her voice warm but insistent. "We just want to honor you, Mr. Tate. The town needs to hear your story." Marcus hesitated, his grip tightening on the phone. He'd spent his life avoiding spotlights, believing service was about doing the job and fading into the back. "I ain't much for speeches," he said, his voice low. "I don't speak for nobody but myself." But the assistant pressed gently. "It's not just for you, sir. It's for them, the kids, the families, the ones who need to know what you carried." Marcus didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. He hung up, staring out his window at the oak tree Caleb had climbed as a boy, its branches now heavy with age. That weekend, Willow Creek stirred with a quiet purpose. At the Rusty Spoon, a local artist named Lena, whose brother had served in Iraq, began sketching on the brick wall near the patio. She worked through the night, her hands smudged with paint, her breath fogging in the cool air. By dawn, a mural took shape, a trident piercing a rope, its lines bold yet weathered like Marcus's tattoo. Below it, in simple script, were the words, "Honor the silent." It wasn't grand, but it didn't need to be. Diners stopped to stare, some snapping photos, others just standing in silence, their coffee growing cold. Holly, who now wore her grandfather's dog tag under her uniform, left a single daisy at the mural's base, her fingers lingering on the brim. The ceremony came on a bright Tuesday, the sky clear and the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. The courthouse square was modest, 50 chairs, a small stage, and an American flag snapping in the breeze. But the crowd was larger than expected, spilling onto the grass. Families, veterans, kids clutching handmade signs that read, "Thank you, Mr. Tate." Ethan Cole was there, standing in the back, his navy dress blues crisp, his eyes fixed on the podium. Holly stood nearby, her hands clasped, her face a mix of pride and grief. Marcus arrived late, his steps slow, his corduroy jacket swapped for a pressed navy blazer, his cane clicking against the pavement. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't wave. He just climbed the steps to the podium, his breath uneven, the weight of their eyes heavier than any gear he'd carried in Vietnam. He had no speech prepared, no notes in his pocket. He stood there, his hands gripping the podium's edges, his hazel eyes scanning the faces before him, young, old, curious, expectant. For a moment, he was back in the jungle, the rain pounding, Caleb's voice promising a cheeseburger, the explosion that silenced it all. Then he was here, in Willow Creek, with the town waiting for words he wasn't sure he had. "I ain't a hero," he began, his voice rough but steady, cutting through the morning air. "I'm just a man who did what he was trained to do and came home with less than he left with. I carry my friend Caleb every day, not because I want to, but because I promised him I would." He paused, his throat tightening, the crowd so still he could hear the rustle of a flag. "You don't serve for medals or thanks. You serve for the man next to you, for the ones who don't make it back. And sometimes the hardest part ain't the war. It's coming home and finding out the world don't see you." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the crowd. A woman in the front row, her scarf wrapped tight, wiped her eyes. A veteran in a wheelchair nodded, his hands clenched in his lap. Kids leaned forward, their signs forgotten, hanging on every word. Marcus's voice grew quieter, but it carried a fire that hadn't burned in years. "Caleb's granddaughter's here today," he said, glancing at Holly, who bit her lip to hold back tears. "She's why I'm talking. Not for me, but for her, for him, for all the promises we keep when nobody's watching." He stepped back, his hands falling to his sides, the silence that followed thicker than any applause could have been. The crowd didn't clap at first. They stood one by one, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Understanding, maybe, or shame, or hope. Ethan saluted from the back, his jaw tight, his eyes damp. Holly stepped forward, hugging Marcus so fiercely he nearly lost his balance, her sobs muffled against his jacket. The mayor tried to speak next, but his words felt small, swallowed by the moment Marcus had created. As the crowd dispersed, people approached Marcus, not with fanfare, but with quiet words, handshakes, stories of their own. A boy, no older than 10, pressed a folded drawing into his hand, a crayon sketch of a soldier and a dog, with "Thank you" scrawled in red. Marcus nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and slipped it into his pocket next to Caleb's photo. Weeks passed, and Willow Creek didn't forget. Marcus's auto shop, once a quiet refuge, became a gathering place. Veterans stopped by, not for repairs, but for coffee and stories. Teens brought their bikes, lingering to hear Marcus talk about Caleb's pranks or the stars over the Mekong. Ethan wrote every month, his letters full of small updates, training drills, a recruit who'd aced a course because of Marcus's maps. Holly visited weekly, bringing coffee and questions about her grandfather, each story stitching her closer to a man she'd never known. The mural at the Rusty Spoon grew into a landmark, a place where strangers left flowers, coins, even dog tags, their metal glinting in the sun. But Marcus felt a shift, a restlessness he couldn't name. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Duke snoring at his feet, he pulled out the letter from his old CO, its ink fading but its words still sharp. "Tate, you carried us through hell." He folded it carefully, his eyes on the horizon where the hills met the sky. The town had seen him, honored him, but something was unfinished. Caleb's promise wasn't just a burger. It was a call to keep moving, to carry the weight for those who couldn't. Marcus didn't know what came next, but he felt it coming like a storm on the wind. A week later, a stranger arrived in Willow Creek. A man in his 60s, his face weathered, his eyes haunted. He carried a duffel bag and a faded photo, identical to the one Marcus kept. "I'm looking for Marcus Tate," he said at the diner, his voice low. "Caleb Monroe's my brother." The words sent a chill through Holly. who stood behind the counter, her hands frozen on a coffee pot. She pointed to the mural, then to the auto shop across town. As the man walked away, the diner buzzed with whispers. Who was he? What did he want? Marcus, working under a truck, didn't know a reckoning was coming, one that would test the promise he'd carried for 49 years and force him to face a truth he'd buried in the jungle. The sun sank low, casting long shadows, and Willow Creek held its breath, waiting for the next chapter of a story that refused to end.